Hey there, history lovers and insomniacs. Welcome aboard the Drowsy Historian, the only place where bedtime stories might leave you shipwrecked on a freezing North Atlantic rock, surrounded by seals, sea mist, and the growing suspicion that you've been lost for 3 weeks. Tonight, we're throwing out your compass, tossing your GPS into the fjord, and asking one question. Could you survive as a Viking navigator? Not just row a boat or grow a beard. I mean truly find your way across open sea, through ice-cold fog, under a sky that hasn't shown the sun in 10 days. Spoiler alert, you'd be very, very wet. And very, very lost. Chapter 1, Lost Among the Fjords. Close your eyes and imagine the coastline of Western Norway. Not the neat postcard view with Instagrammable villages, but the real thing. A fractured, saw-toothed nightmare of black stone cliffs, hidden bays, and curling fjords that stretch for miles inland like watery traps. The terrain isn't coastal, it's coastal chaos. Navigating this wasn't like steering along a beach. It was like wandering through a forest with a blindfold on, where every tree looks the same and half of them lead to sudden death by drowning. This is where our Viking journey begins. On a ship carved from oak, heaving between the labyrinth of fjords where even local fishermen got turned around. You're not sailing out from a neat harbour. You're trying to find the sea through a needle's eye of ice and rock, while your crew silently judges your lack of direction. And no, there is no map. Meet Hrafn, not a hero. Just a competent enough sailor, not a chieftain, not a berserker. Just a man with a sun-weathered face and a memory full of wave patterns. He's about to take you through a channel that looks exactly like the last 4 channels. You ask him where you are. He gestures vaguely with his chin, past the island that looks like a sleeping cow. That's not helpful. You haven't seen a cow in days. Everything looks like a cold rock with moss. And moss, as you'll learn soon enough, is no compass. The reality is, Viking navigation wasn't built for amateurs or day trippers. There were no symbols etched in stone saying, "This way to Greenland." Instead, it relied on something both beautiful and terrifying, memory. Raw, squishy, error-prone human memory. The roots weren't drawn. They were sung. They lived in the heads of men who had spent decades at sea, learning by failure, fear, and frostbite. These memory maps, or sailing rhymes, were passed from elder to apprentice like ghost stories. Sail 2 days west until the sea turns black, then look for the bird who screams at dawn. Practical, poetic, and completely useless in fog. And fog was always waiting. This wasn't sunny Spain. These were latitudes where clouds took months-long vacations right above your boat. When visibility dropped to arm's length, which it did regularly, Hrafn didn't panic. He squinted at the colour of the water, tasted the salt, listened to the wind, watched the flight of a bird, and tried to remember whether the last screaming gull meant coastline near or open ocean. It's like playing charades with the atmosphere. Critics love to romanticize this era. Vikings were master navigators, they cry, sure. In the same way, tightrope walkers are masters, right up until they fall. Navigation was survival, and survival meant clinging to rituals, gut instincts, and sometimes just dumb luck. The margin for error wasn't, oops, wrong turn. It was, oops, everyone's dead. And yet modern culture clings to this fantasy that you could throw on a fur cloak, grunt convincingly, and sail for glory. As if glory weren't mostly made of scurvy, misdirection, and conversations that began with, "Wait, weren't those mountains supposed to be on the left?" But let's go back to Hrafn. He's scanning the fjord, face taut, pretending to be sure. You and your soft modern senses are cold, wet, and seasick. You haven't seen a landmark in a day. The crew is quiet, which in Viking culture is worse than yelling. They've started whispering. That's Viking HR speak, for this idiot might get us all killed. You want to ask for a map, but there's no cartographer on board. Just the occasional carved runestone placed at a harbour 2 weeks back, which you forgot to read. Do you remember that scene in every Viking show where they push off from land, all confident, oars rising in perfect rhythm, beards majestic in the wind? That's the first 5 minutes. The next 50 are people throwing up, rowing in silence, and someone misidentifying a whale as an island. The truth is, most journeys didn't end in glory. They ended in fog and drift, and sometimes landing on the wrong continent entirely. Still feel ready to be a navigator? Even when they reached open sea, things didn't get easier. The fjords were just the beginning. Confusing, majestic, bone-chilling corridors of nature that punished overconfidence. Some historians argue that half of Viking exploration was just navigation errors that no one admitted. Iceland? Probably an accident. Greenland? A bigger accident. Vinland, aka North America? The biggest accident of them all. But if you got there alive, you were a hero. If not, you became a footnote, or worse, part of the seafood chain. Modern people love the idea of off-grid travel, but let's be honest. If Google Maps crashes for more than 30 seconds, half of us get lost inside a shopping mall. Imagine being alone in a 50-foot wooden boat with no compass, no phone, no way to mark distance, and every cloud looking like doom. You wouldn't last a day, not even until lunch. Hrafn, though, survives this leg of the journey. Barely. He navigates by smell, by bird call, by salt taste and sky hue. Not because he's a genius, but because he doesn't have a choice. And when he finally sees the open sea through a thin crack in the cliffs, he doesn't celebrate. He tightens his grip on the rudder. The real journey is just beginning. And you? You're already regretting every decision that led you to get on this boat. Once the fjords were behind them, those towering stone teeth clamped around narrow stretches of water like the jaws of a half-awake god. The Viking ship entered the next phase of doom, the open sea. No land in sight, no stars in the daytime, and, crucially, no compass. That little invention that sits ignored in your car dashboard or digital watch hadn't reached Europe yet. Not for another few centuries. The Vikings, they were the original figure-it-out-as-you-go navigators. And if you didn't figure it out fast, you figured out how drowning felt instead. Let's be clear, when we say no compass, we don't mean they left it at home by mistake. We mean there was no such tool. Instead, Viking sailors relied on a handful of tricks, superstitions, and one very debated object, the Sunstone. Supposedly a translucent crystal-like calcite or cordierite. It was said to polarize sunlight and let a trained navigator locate the position of the sun even through overcast skies. Sounds clever, right? The problem is, we still don't know for sure if they actually used it. No definitive archaeological evidence has proven its use. So if you're on this boat hoping someone has a backup sunstone in their satchel, you're banking on folklore, which is roughly the same as betting your mortgage on a dream you had about a talking raccoon. But Hrafn, our unassuming guide from segment 1, doesn't need folklore. He needs patterns. Patterns in the waves, in the wind, in the calls of birds that don't land on ships unless land is near. He reads the ocean like a monk reads scripture, obsessively, reverently, and always with a hint of fear. Because fear is healthy. Fear is what reminds you that 80% of your boat's crew can't swim. It reminds you that falling overboard means hypothermia before you finish your second scream. It reminds you that this ship is made of wood, held together with iron nails and hope. And let's pause here to criticize just a little, because it's deserved. The modern mythology of the Viking sailor is absurdly heroic. People imagine leather-clad supermen, standing proudly on their longships, squinting into the horizon like they're auditioning for a Nordic perfume ad. What no one shows is the cramping, the constant dampness, the fact that most Viking ships didn't have cabins, let alone privacy. You were exposed to the elements, to each other, and to the increasingly strong smell of salted fish mixed with unwashed men. Think about that next time someone glamorizes roughing it. This was roughing it with no insurance, no backup, and no margin for stupid decisions. Still, the ocean wasn't just danger. It was a canvas of secrets. The Vikings noticed things others didn't. They observed that swell directions changed as they neared islands, that seaweed types shifted depending on proximity to land, that cloud formation sometimes mirrored coastlines, or that whales migrated along similar routes each year. Hrafn had learned these cues since he was a child, trained not by charts, but by the gruff mutterings of older sailors who, when they died, took half the sea's secrets with them. One of Hrafn's earliest lessons came from a grizzled man missing 2 fingers and most of his teeth. When you see 2 kinds of birds arguing in the sky, the man had said, you're either near land or about to die. Comforting, isn't it? But those bird fights were genuine signs. Different species clashed over territory, especially near nesting grounds. A sailor who paid attention could use avian rage as a crude GPS. It wasn't elegant, but neither was sailing blind through a salt storm. Now let's talk about distance. How did they measure it? Answer, they didn't really. Time and gut feeling substituted for any kind of objective tracking. We've been rowing for 3 suns, a navigator might say, which could mean anything from 180 to 240 kilometres depending on wind, current, crew morale, and how many people had diarrhea that day. If someone asked for an ETA, the best answer was a shrug and a prayer. As for direction, the sun helped when visible. Otherwise, some Vikings probably used primitive sun compasses, wooden discs with carvings that cast a shadow when placed flat under the sun, helping align their bearings. That's clever. Except when it rained, or snowed, or fogged, or when the disc floated off the side of the boat, or when Bjorn used it to serve dried fish and forgot to return it. So, as they sailed deeper into the sea, the clouds thicken. The wind shifts. Hrafn frowns. He's tracking the rhythm of the waves now. Deep water swells move in long, rolling pulses. But coastal waters? Choppier. Shorter bursts. It's subtle. So subtle you'd miss it, unless you'd spent your life doing nothing but staring at waves and smelling rain. This is what the job demands. Hyper-awareness. Exhaustion. A level of intuitive sea sense that makes modern GPS feel like cheating. Which it is. Wonderful, glorious cheating. And here's the sarcastic twist. Modern people can't even remember 5 phone numbers without a contact list. Meanwhile, Hrafn's brain contains hundreds of invisible miles of wave shape, wind speed, bird behaviour, and cloud memory. He couldn't spell longitude if you carved it into his shield, but he could probably sail from Norway to Iceland with his eyes half closed and one hand on a rope, which, by the way, he's had to do during storms. Storms. We'll get to them in another chapter. But just know, if you hit one out here, your odds depend less on boat design and more on how well you can pray in Old Norse. By now the crew is restless. Not scared, not yet. But that murmur of tension simmers in every glance. You ask where you are. Hrafn gives the same chin point he did last time. Past the whale path. If we're lucky, we'll see gulls by sunrise. That's code for, we might be off by 100 miles. Still, they sail on. Because turning back is worse. Because this ship, crude as it seems, is an instrument of belief. Belief in the old ways, in the gods, in the sea's rhythm. The open ocean wasn't an enemy. It was a test. Fail, and you fed the sea. Pass, and you might just find new land, new plunder, or at the very least a coastline that didn't try to kill you on sight. And here you are, wrapped in a damp fur, heart pounding with every dip of the prow, surrounded by men who live and die by instincts you don't even understand. There's no app to download, no satellite to phone. Just the wind, the birds, and the barely holding it. Together psyche of a man named Hrafn, whose only true tool is memory. Next time you brag about your sense of direction after finding the parking lot exit at IKEA, remember this moment. Because you would have turned around hours ago. Chapter 2, Reading the Skies Without a Compass. Let's say you've made it through the fjords without crashing into a rock, or accidentally circling back to where you started, which, frankly, already puts you above average in Viking standards. You're now bobbing in the middle of a vast, indifferent ocean with nothing around you except rolling waves and skies that change their mind every few minutes. There's no compass, no map, no coastline to reference. The stars are invisible by day, the birds have vanished. And that heavy grey blanket of clouds above your head, that's your enemy now. Because without the sun, you're flying blind. And the Vikings? They stared straight into that blindness and dared it to blink. You might think, surely they had some method, some clever workaround. And they did, sort of. It was called looking up and guessing. The technique involved squinting at the sky, tracking the arc of the sun, if it existed, and calculating your direction based on gut feeling, wave tilt, and the disappointing lack of better options. But when the clouds rolled in, and in the North Atlantic they always did, you were forced to make decisions in a world where everything looked the same and none of it wanted you to survive. North, east, west and death were all equally grey. Still, Viking navigators like Hrafn didn't panic, at least not outwardly. Outward panic was frowned upon. The Vikings respected men who died in storms, not men who whimpered through them. Instead, they did what generations had done before. They relied on rhythm, intuition, and, perhaps, the mysterious Sunstone. Ah yes, the infamous Viking solar GPS, beloved by romantic historians and fantasy authors alike. The idea is beautiful. A semi-transparent crystal, possibly calcite or cordierite, held up to the overcast sky to detect the sun's polarization, revealing its hidden position. Science fiction in a sheepskin cloak. But here's the problem. It's mostly speculation. No confirmed sunstone has ever been found in an excavated Viking ship or settlement. It's like the historical equivalent of saying ancient astronauts built the pyramids, but with fewer aliens and more fog. And yet the myth persists, because we love imagining ancient people as magical geniuses. It's more comfortable than admitting they were mostly freezing, hungry, and gambling with their lives every time they stepped onto a boat. So let's put the Sunstone aside and return to reality. One filled with overcast skies, rough seas, and a crew that hasn't eaten a warm meal in days. Hrafn stands at the helm, peering into the sky like it owes him money, trying to detect a break in the clouds. Maybe he sees a faint glow. Maybe he lies about seeing it to keep morale up. Either way, the ship adjusts course, based not on science, but on the kind of quiet confidence that either saves lives or dooms them. Here's something most people forget. The North Atlantic isn't just big. It's featureless. No landmarks. No island chain to hopscotch across. Just thousands of kilometers of water that shifts, swells and shrinks in unpredictable ways. Vikings learned to read the texture of waves. A long, slow swell might suggest open ocean. Choppier ones hinted at nearby land. But this was instinct more than fact, and even seasoned navigators admitted they were often wrong. The sea, like any cruel teacher, punished mistakes without explanation. Now imagine spending weeks on that sea with no clock, no sextant, and no way to know how far you've gone, except by estimating rowing hours or sail time. A gust of wind could undo a full day's progress. A storm could spin you in circles. And yet, historians often praise Viking navigation as astonishingly accurate. Which it occasionally was, because failure doesn't get written down. Ships that never arrived weren't carved into rune stones. They just vanished. So our surviving records are biased towards success. And every time you read about a triumphant landing in Iceland or Vinland, remember, for every Hrafn who made it, there was someone else who ended up as whale food. Of course, not every method was guesswork. Some navigators carried primitive tools. Wooden sun compasses that could help track solar movement, shadow sticks that hinted at direction during clear weather. But these were crude at best, and their effectiveness dropped to zero under thick cloud cover. You might as well pray to the gods, which, come to think of it, they did, frequently. Navigation rituals were common. Offerings were made before voyages, not because Thor helped steer, but because hope was a poor sailor's only consistent companion. Let's take a moment to appreciate just how terrifying that level of uncertainty really is. In modern life, the worst navigational error most people make is taking the wrong highway exit and spending 15 minutes rerouting. You don't usually die because you missed a turn, but for Viking crews, a wrong heading meant drifting for weeks, running out of supplies, or worse, stumbling upon hostile shores. Imagine reaching land after 2 weeks at sea, only to find that land filled with armed monks who aren't thrilled to see you. Surprise, you've invented the raid. That's the thing about Viking expansion. It wasn't always a master plan. Sometimes it was a navigational error that happened to include a monastery in the way. We picture these explorations as deliberate, but often they were acts of desperation wrapped in confidence. Sail west, they said. We might find new land, or we might find death. Either way, at least it's not boring. Back on the ship, Raffen squints at the sky again. A break in the clouds reveals the sun, just briefly. He notes the angle, adjusts the rudder. Doesn't say much. A good navigator never shows doubt, even when it's all he has. The crew pretends not to notice the tension. They chew their dried fish, spit into the wind, and whisper quietly about omens. Someone claims he saw a red sun at dawn. Someone else says a raven flew east that morning. Superstition fills the gaps where science fails. And in this world, there are a lot of gaps. Let's not forget the physical toll either. Constant cold, wet clothing that never fully dries, salt chafing every surface of exposed skin, cramped sleeping conditions, no fresh food, no clean water, just brine, bone chill, and the never-ending sway of the ocean. Some sailors cracked under it, others simply died of exposure or illness. There's no way to exaggerate this. Viking navigation wasn't heroic. It was brutal. It was punishing. And it killed the unprepared. But maybe that's why they kept doing it. Not because they were fearless, but because the land they came from was equally harsh. Norway's rocky coasts offered little farmland. Winter was cruel, hunger was frequent. Setting sail wasn't just ambition, it was necessity. And sometimes necessity is the cruelest motivator of all. So next time someone romanticizes the Viking Age, remember this scene. Remember Hrafn staring at the sky, pretending he knows what he's doing. Remember the crew whispering about birds and omens. And remember that all of them are lost, in a way. Not because they're incompetent, but because nature doesn't care how brave you are. The sea is bigger than your ego. The sky is colder than your courage. And when you're out there with nothing but a gut feeling and a hunch about sunlight, the line between success and shipwreck gets very, very thin. You wouldn't survive an hour. Night falls. The sky clears briefly. The cold has sharpened the wind into something metallic, biting at skin and thoughts alike. Hrafn leans back, his eyes fixed on the heavens, not in wonder, but in calculation. Because now, for the first time all day, he sees something he's been waiting for. Stars. Tiny, flickering reminders that direction still exists. Even out here. Even when the rest of the world feels like a blank slate of darkness and dread. To the untrained, it's beautiful. To the trained, it's data. But here's the cruel part. Even the stars can lie. Or at least, you can misread them. And at sea, a misread is sometimes just a poetic word for death. In the Viking mind, the night sky was both a map and a myth. Constellations weren't just shapes, they were stories. Ørn, the eagle. Kaupmatha, the merchant. Patterns passed down orally, not for stargazing delight, but for survival. You needed to know which way the goat rose, where the whale dipped, how the great bear circled. But these weren't fixed like the North Star in a classroom diagram. Depending on the time of year, the location, and how sleep-deprived you were, the night sky might play tricks on you. And if you made the mistake of thinking you were under the same sky as home, you weren't. The latitude was different. The seasons warped the patterns. The sea skewed your position by miles while you weren't looking. Navigation by stars is romantic. But romance doesn't patch holes or feed hungry sailors. Still, Vikings like Hrafn used what they had. The North Star Polaris was their north anchor. But it wasn't always obvious. In misty skies or during the peak of summer's endless light, Polaris might fade or blend. The sagas spoke of using it, but sagas also spoke of dragons and sky chariots. Which ones were metaphors and which were manuals? Hard to say when your teeth are chattering. There's a charming notion floating around modern media that the Vikings were celestial geniuses, navigating from Scandinavia to Vinland with flawless precision. It's a nice thought, and completely absurd. The reality was far messier, more human, and more gut-wrenchingly chaotic. Successful voyages happened, yes, but many didn't. There were Viking ships that set sail and were never heard from again. Their names disappeared from history, not because they weren't brave, but because bravery doesn't impress the sea. In the eyes of the Atlantic, all courage eventually drowns. Let's dig into their toolset again. Aside from the stars and that maybe, Sunstone, what else did they have? Soundings. Measuring water depth using lines and weighted ropes. It worked well near coasts, useless in deep sea. Birds were helpful near land, useless in open ocean. And there's the ever-useful smell of seaweed. No, really. Some Viking navigators claimed they could scent land by the presence of certain kelp floating near the surface. Add that to your list of skills: star reader, wave whisperer, professional kelp sniffer. But perhaps the most astonishing detail isn't what tools they used, it's how little they needed. Navigation for Vikings was largely oral tradition. Not charts, not instruments, but memory. Routes passed from mouth to ear, generation to generation. Sail west for 2 full watches after the whale path, then turn north when the sky deepens. These weren't GPS coordinates. They were poetic riddles soaked in salt water. And somehow they worked. Not because they were perfect, but because they were learned, lived, and brutally tested. A man who failed the route didn't get to teach it. This brings us back to Hrafn, staring at the stars as the wind bites through his fur cloak. He's remembering stories, rhythms, the time his uncle drifted too far west and ended up on a rock-strewn beach, surrounded by angry seals and nothing else. That man came back with frostbitten fingers and half his crew dead. The story ended with a laugh. Most Viking stories do. Because if you didn't laugh, you cried. And if you cried, you got mocked. And if you got mocked, you were probably already dead in the next storm anyway. Night sailing required silence. The crew spoke only when necessary. Every whisper felt like an intrusion on the sky. It's an eerie quiet, not peaceful, just tense. Everyone hoping the navigator knows what he's doing. Everyone pretending that their faith in the stars will somehow guarantee safe passage. But faith doesn't pay the toll when you hit unexpected ice, or when the wind shifts against you and the stars disappear under sudden cloud banks. That's when the muttering starts. The glances. The realization that human certainty is as fragile as the moonlight skimming the waves. And let's criticize the modern admiration one more time, because it needs repeating. Today, we worship technology. We panic if Google Maps lags. But we also indulge in the fantasy that we'd thrive in ancient times, that we'd be brave Viking explorers with wind-burnt cheeks and impeccable directional instincts. Reality check. Most modern people wouldn't survive a single day on a longship. You'd cry the first time your blanket froze solid. You'd puke before breakfast. And the moment someone handed you a chunk of dried fish and said, "This is dinner and also the pillow," you'd mutiny or die trying. The Viking navigator didn't just need endurance, he needed judgment. At every moment he was weighing risks, reading skies, interpreting silence. There was no room for indecision. Even a 2-degree error meant missing land by hundreds of miles. That's not an inconvenience. That's a death sentence with extra salt. And yet they kept sailing. Not because they had all the answers, but because they had no better options. The sea, for all its cruelty, offered something the land didn't. Possibility. New coasts. New loot. New gods, maybe. Or just better farmland and fewer taxes. The sea was terrifying, yes, but it was also a blank slate, and to a Viking, that was irresistible. So Hrafn plots his course using stars that most of us can't even name. His hands grip the steering oar, eyes flicking between constellations, clouds, and the sway of his crewmates. The wind moans low, the sails strain, and the boat creaks like it's remembering every mistake anyone ever made aboard it. He gives the command. The ship shifts direction. No fanfare, no speeches. Just the soft scrape of wood and the hopeful silence of men pretending they aren't afraid. You close your eyes, hoping the stars are kind. They usually aren't. Chapter 3. The Sunstone Mystery. Imagine you're standing on the deck of a longship with cold wind clawing at your face, and a crew that's been surviving on dried fish and awkward silences for 8 days. The sky is the colour of old dishwater. The sun hasn't made an appearance since yesterday, and you, dear navigator, are being stared at like a human compass that's gone suspiciously quiet. You need to know where west is, or north, or quite frankly, any direction that leads away from drifting into oblivion. You squint at the pale dome of sky, searching for a hint of sunlight, but all you get is mist. You reach into a pouch, pull out a translucent crystal, and hold it toward the heavens. Supposedly, this will help. Allegedly, it will reveal the hidden sun. This is your Sunstone part artifact, part folklore, part navigational, Hail Mary. And whether it's real or just a beautifully told lie depends entirely on which historian you ask and how generous you are with your definitions of evidence. The Sunstone, or Solarstein, exists in that foggy zone of historical maybe. It appears in a 13th century Icelandic saga, the kind full of grand speeches, feuds, and the occasional magical goat. According to the story, King Olaf's men were caught in bad weather. The sky was overcast, the horizon blurred, and they had no idea where the sun was. A character took out a sunstone, held it up, and declared the sun's position with confidence. Cue the applause. But sagas weren't known for their commitment to realism. They were oral storytelling set to blood and weather, not peer-reviewed journals. The mention of a sunstone could mean anything. A metaphor, a lost technology, or someone high on fermented honey declaring they'd solved the problem of celestial navigation using pocket quartz. Still, modern scientists became intrigued. Into calcite, cordierite, and tourmaline crystals capable of polarizing light. These minerals can, under the right conditions, help determine the sun's direction by revealing patterns in skylight polarization, even when the sun isn't directly visible. This is not fiction. It's optical physics. Vikings wouldn't have used those terms, of course. They probably said something like, the shiny rock that works if you know how to squint properly. But the science is real. The crystal could theoretically work. The catch? We've never found one in a confirmed Viking context. Not a single sunstone in a grave, shipwreck, or settlement site. If they existed, they vanished without a trace, or were never there to begin with. Still, let's indulge the idea. Let's say Hrafn, our ever-suffering navigator, is one of the few trained in the mysterious art of crystal navigation. He's been taught to hold the stone at certain angles, to rotate it slowly while observing the way light refracts across its surface. With enough experience, he can estimate the sun's position with some accuracy. Not satellite-grade precision, but enough to keep the ship from veering wildly into the Arctic Circle. In this version of history, the Sunstone is a secret weapon, handed from master to apprentice, guarded like a relic of the gods. It sounds glorious, doesn't it? A lost technology that bridges science and myth. Proof that the Vikings were even more advanced than we give them credit for. But here's the criticism that always needs airing. We love to backfill genius into ancient civilizations. It makes us feel connected. It makes the past seem less brutal, less random. But most innovation, especially in harsh environments, isn't genius. It's desperation layered over trial and error. The Sunstone, if real, wasn't some elegant marvel. It was probably used alongside a dozen other vague methods, none of which worked particularly well alone. The Vikings weren't sky wizards. They were risk-takers who occasionally struck gold by accident and filled the rest with brute endurance. Back on the longship, the crew doesn't care about optical physics. They care about whether Hrafn is pointing them toward land or into endless ocean. They don't see the fine line between a brilliant deduction and a reckless guess. The crystal shines faintly in the pale daylight, casting a ghost of a glow. Hrafn marks the angle, adjusts the sail, and calls out a course. The men obey. There is no debate. If he's right, they reach Greenland in a few days. If he's wrong, they find nothing but water and regret. It's worth noting that the Vikings didn't think of the sea as a blank expanse. They believed it was alive, with moods and messages. The Sunstone, if used, was just one of many omens, no more mystical than a raven flying west or the shape of foam on a wave. Navigators like Hrafn didn't trust just one tool. They triangulated between memory, instinct, superstition, and luck, and somehow it often worked. Not always, but often enough that sagas could be written about the ones who made it. So why is the Sunstone myth so persistent? Because it gives us something comforting, a talisman, a trick, a shortcut that says, see, they had technology too. It flatters modern sensibilities. It implies order where there was mostly chaos. But if you want a more honest version of Viking navigation, imagine this. A man staring into a cloudy sky holding a rock, silently praying that his guess is close enough to survival. That's not cinematic. But it's probably true. And if you, reading this under electric lights and surrounded by GPS-enabled devices, think you'd have done better, think again. You wouldn't know how to use a sunstone. You wouldn't even know how to identify one. If handed a chunk of calcite, you'd probably ask if it came from a souvenir shop. The only thing you'd contribute to this journey is one more mouth to feed and one more body for the sea to claim when the food ran out. The truth is, the Sunstone is less a miracle and more a metaphor, a symbol of how humans, when pressed by nature's indifference, will try anything. Guesswork disguised as clarity, crystal as compass, hope masquerading as knowledge. And sometimes that's enough. Sometimes it works. But don't confuse that with mastery, because even Hrafn, crystal in hand, isn't sure. He never was. The sea had calmed, which was always suspicious. Any Viking worth his salt or soaked in it knew the North Atlantic didn't calm unless it was plotting something. The sky remained stubbornly overcast, its mood undecipherable, and the crew had begun to feel that crawling unease, the kind that eats away at certainty when silence grows longer than it should. Hrafn stood at the helm, sunstone in hand, not for the first time today, and certainly not for the last. He held it up, turned it slowly, studying how the milky crystal distorted the dim light. A few men watched, trying to read his face the way they once tried to read stars. But there were no stars, not anymore, not for days. And when the heavens vanished, men started looking elsewhere, for signs, for symbols, for anything that might restore the illusion that they were still in control. The truth was, nobody really knew how the Sunstone worked. Not even Hrafn. His father had taught him to use it, and his father's father had claimed to use it too, though Hrafn suspected that generation did more improvising than guiding. Hold it up, look through it, tilt it until the light splits, feel for the direction of the hidden sun. Those were the steps. But the last part, the feel of it, that was the part no one could explain. And in that ambiguity lived the danger. Because when you're looking through a rock to find salvation, you're already past the point of reason and well into the realm of faith. And there it is, faith. Not in gods, though those were certainly evoked, but faith in the idea that humans could trick the ocean into giving up its secrets. The Sunstone became, over time, more than a tool. It became a ritual, a comfort object, a shard of belief that maybe, just maybe, the forces of nature could be tamed by holding a shiny thing up to the sky and pretending to understand what it was saying. It's the same kind of belief that compels people today to shake a remote when the batteries die, or to scream at Wi-Fi routers. It doesn't help, but it feels like doing something. That was the role the Sunstone now played on this voyage. Not as a perfect solution, but as a coping mechanism. The crew didn't know if it worked. Most had never seen it used successfully. But they also didn't want to face the reality of steering blind. So when Hruffin held it aloft and announced west by south, they nodded, adjusted the sail, and said nothing. Because challenging the navigator, even quietly, meant inviting chaos. Better to row towards something than admit you were surrounded by nothing. This is how fragile authority is, how easily it hinges on confidence, or at least the appearance of it. Hraffin's hand didn't tremble, though his stomach did. Not from fear, but hunger. The salted herring had run low, and the bread was now more mould than grain. That didn't matter to the men yet, but it would soon. Hunger always arrived just behind doubt. They'd follow him as long as they believed he knew where he was going. But belief was fickle, and the Sunstone's glow was thin. Historically, it's unclear how often these kinds of talismans were trusted over traditional cues. Vikings were not, as modern fandom likes to pretend, magical storm whisperers with enchanted artifacts. They were, more often, exhausted farmers, turned sailors clinging to any scrap of repeatable success they could find. Maybe the Sunstone worked once. Maybe it didn't. But if a navigator survived a voyage while using one, the myth wrote itself. Success was proof of function, regardless of logic. This is the same reasoning that leads people today to swear by lucky socks or cursed vending machines. The pattern doesn't have to be real, it just has to feel real. Let's indulge for a moment the skeptical crewman. Every ship had one. Maybe on this voyage it was Thormund, a burly carpenter with a nose for lies and a face that hadn't smiled since spring. He didn't believe in the Sunstone, said it was just glass, or maybe ice, or maybe something Hruffin found in a stream and got romantic about. But he still rowed when told. That's how authority works in desperate places. It wears the mask of confidence until someone dares to tear it off. And by then, it's too late. The tension grows subtly. Not mutiny, not yet. Just questions. Is the wind stronger than yesterday? Did the swell change? Why does the sky look different? These aren't just observations, they're alarms disguised as curiosity. And Hruffin hears them all. He tightens his grip on the steering oar, glances at the sky, then at the stone, then at the horizon, as if expecting one of them to blink first. They never do. This was the real danger of the Sunstone. Not that it didn't work, but that it invited overconfidence. It promised guidance in a world where there often was none. The more you trusted it, the more you relied on it, and the less you questioned your course. It gave the illusion of progress while stealing the instinct to doubt. In this way, it wasn't just a tool, it was a trap. That's the uncomfortable truth about human navigation in a pre-instrument world. We weren't built to understand the ocean. We were built to fear it, to respect it, to avoid it whenever possible. The Vikings didn't sail because they thought it was safe. They sailed because the land often offered even fewer promises. The Sunstone, in this context, wasn't just about finding the sun. It was about justifying the madness of leaving home without a map. Now, as the ship continues on its uncertain course, the mood darkens. Not just because of the weather, though clouds have begun to gather again, but because that thin thread of belief is beginning to fray. Hrafn senses it. He knows how quickly a crew's reverence can turn to resentment. He knows that his authority is only as strong as the next good guess, and if the crystal fails him, if land doesn't appear soon, it won't matter whether the sun ever existed behind those clouds. It'll be his neck, not the Sunstone's, on the line. The irony is rich. We idolize Viking courage, yet forget that most of it was just fear dressed up in furs. The courage to set sail into the unknown is admirable, yes, but it's also evidence of just how bleak staying put must have been. People don't flirt with death because they're brave. They do it because they're out of better options. And when you've got nothing left but a translucent rock and a legend to cling to, you hold that thing up like a relic, pretend it whispers truth, and hope no one notices how desperate you really are. As night falls again and the clouds swallow even the ghost of the sun, Hrafn wraps the stone in cloth and places it back in his pouch. He says nothing. Neither do the men. They just row and breathe and wait for either land or reckoning. Chapter 5: Birds, Whales, and Guesswork. By the time Hrafn had sailed through his 15th fob bank and listened to his crew's stomachs argue louder than their mouths, he found himself doing what every Viking navigator eventually did, turning to animals for advice. Not in a mystical, shamanistic way, but in the way a desperate person stares at a pigeon and silently pleads, "Do you know where I am?" The sea had gone quiet again. The sky offered no clues, and the ship creaked like it was tired of holding everyone's weight, both physical and existential. So Hrafn did what his father had done before him. He went to the birdcage. Yes, the longship carried birds, not for decoration, not even for food, though that had been discussed once when the supplies ran dangerously low. These birds, usually ravens or occasionally homing pigeons, were tools. Living compasses. The idea was simple. Release a bird, and if it flew straight and didn't come back, land must be in that direction. If it circled and returned, you were too far out. If it flew up, panicked, and exploded into a storm cloud, well, that was probably a bad sign. This method, while seemingly clever, was far from foolproof. Birds are creatures of instinct, not navigational charts. They follow winds, migratory paths, gut feelings, kind of like Viking navigators, but with even less accountability. And yet, for men trapped in a wooden shell drifting across indifferent waters, the brief flap of wings offered something maps couldn't: movement, agency. A decision made by something not currently dying of exposure. So Hrafn opened the cage. The bird inside blinked at him with the dull disinterest of something that had seen too much and understood even less. He held it, whispered something only half-jokingly resembling a prayer, and let go. The raven burst upward, then arched into the grey horizon, veering slightly west. A good sign? A fluke? An omen? No one knew. But the men cheered anyway, because when your brain has been marinating in salt for 2 weeks, even a bird's vague sense of direction feels like divine intervention. Critics love to romanticize this process. Ah, the noble Viking, releasing his raven beneath the dawn sky, guided by nature's wisdom. Sure, nature's wisdom, as interpreted by a guy who hasn't slept in 3 days and thinks seagulls sound like his mother yelling. Let's be real, this was guesswork. Slightly informed, highly desperate guesswork. And yet it often worked, sort of. Not because it was brilliant, but because sometimes birds fly toward land, and sometimes that's all you need to survive another day. But birds weren't the only animals pressed into navigational service. Enter the whale, not metaphorically, literally. Vikings observed whale behaviour with an almost reverent attention. If whales appeared swimming in pods, it could mean you were approaching a shelf of shallow waters. If they surfaced at odd intervals, perhaps it was a migration route one that led to Iceland or beyond. Some men swore that whales only appeared within a certain distance of land. Others believed whales avoided the open sea entirely. Both ideas were wrong often enough to be dangerous, but right just enough to stick. One story Huffen had heard in his youth involved a ship that followed a pair of whales for 2 days, convinced they were leading the way to Vinland. On the 3rd day, the whales vanished. The ship drifted for another week before turning back. When they returned to Greenland, one sailor insisted the whales had been testing them. Testing, as if animals exist to play games with men lost at sea. This, of course, is what desperation does. It assigns motive to coincidence, intelligence to instinct. A whale surfaces? It must be signalling. A bird returns? It must be warning you. A seal barks? Perhaps it's trying to communicate directions. Or maybe, just maybe, it's a seal being a seal, and you're losing your grip on reality. That's the darker truth beneath this charming tale of man and nature, the illusion of partnership. The belief that animals are co-pilots rather than passengers. But the ocean doesn't grant relationships. It offers situations, and the creatures that live in it are surviving, not guiding. They don't care if you drown. They don't care if your bird flies the wrong way. They are part of the landscape, not part of the solution. And yet, Hruffen, like so many before him, couldn't help but hope. Because when all else failed, sun, stars, stones, memory, sometimes all you had left was a flutter of feathers or a plume of spray. And hope, as useless as it often is, tends to survive longer than logic. Now let's talk about the unintended consequences of relying on animal signs. For every bird that led a crew home, there were 3 that led them into storms, or over reefs, or nowhere at all. Birds don't measure wind speed. Whales don't account for ship drafts. They go where they go, and following them blindly was sometimes the last mistake a Viking ever made. And yet modern admiration remains high. The eco-navigator, the natural pathfinder, buzzwords tossed around like badges of honour. We pretend that because Vikings used birds and whales, they were more in tune with nature. But let's be clear, using animals out of necessity isn't harmony. It's resourcefulness dressed in desperation. It's no different than following ants to water or watching cows for signs of rain. It's clever. It's practical. But it's not mystical. And it certainly isn't infallible. By late afternoon, the bird had not returned. The men took it as a sign that land was ahead. Spirits lifted. Songs were hummed. Even Hruffen allowed himself a moment of relief, but he also knew that the bird might have died, hit by a gust, picked off by a hawk, gotten bored and flown the wrong way. The truth, whatever it was, would reveal itself soon enough. It always did. So they adjusted course slightly west, not dramatically, never dramatically. Drastic changes at sea were how you ended up somewhere no one would ever find your bones. Just enough of a turn to follow a bird-shaped theory. The ocean didn't protest. It simply rolled on, indifferent as ever. That night, as the ship creaked and the men tried to sleep, Hruffen lay awake. Not from fear, but from thought. He wondered how many others had followed birds into nothing. How many whales had beckoned ships to doom. How many navigators had whispered prayers to indifferent wings, only to vanish into the fog, forgotten except as warnings. And he wondered quietly if tomorrow would bring land, or just another bird. By morning, the bird had not returned. It was either dead, successful, or smarter than everyone else on the ship. Maybe it had found a cliff to nest on, away from the smell of men and fish guts and doubt. Or maybe it had flown in circles until it vanished into sky and sea like everything else. Either way, the ship was still here, still floating, and still very much without a confirmed destination. The Raven's absence, however, had begun to take on a new role. It wasn't just a navigational data point anymore. It was a story, a signal, an omen. Because when real maps don't exist, and guesses begin to wear thin, humans do what they've always done. They rewrite the unknown into meaning. Hruffen had seen this before. A bird returns? It's a warning? A bird vanishes, it's a blessing. A bird circles overhead without landing, clearly a spirit trapped between realms, probably angry, maybe helpful, definitely significant. This wasn't unique to Vikings. Sailors in every age have assigned personalities to animals. But the Vikings, with their myth-soaked culture and storytelling addiction, elevated it into ritual. Birds didn't just fly, they judged. Whales didn't just swim, they guided. Foxes were cunning. Bears noble. Gulls? Probably the souls of drowned warriors. Why not? If you're cold, lost and hungry, even nonsense starts to sound like scripture. The problem was, once the crew began interpreting signs, the signs never stopped. One man said he dreamed of a white bird and saw it as confirmation that they'd make landfall soon. Another claimed a seal had looked at him oddly the night before, which surely meant something, though he couldn't explain what. Soon every splash, squawk or gust became prophecy. And prophecy is dangerous when it starts to influence rudder turns. You begin steering not with instinct, but with superstition. Not with skill, but with consensus. And that's how ships end up following whale trails straight into submerged reefs. Rafton tried to keep it grounded. He reminded the men that the bird was a tool, not a priest. But they didn't want realism. Realism tasted like salt and defeat. They wanted purpose. A story. Some divine stamp of approval on their suffering. That was always the great trick of hardship. It made meaning seductive, and the sea offered none, just waves and wind and silence. So they created their own. Let's not pretend this is ancient ignorance either. Today, people still assign significance to things that don't deserve it. A stock market dip blamed on Mercury in retrograde. A broken phone blamed on karma. A politician's victory explained by moon cycles. The only difference between them and Huffin's crew is Wi-Fi and better lighting. Humans are meaning machines. We cannot tolerate randomness, especially when randomness might mean we're lost. Back in Hraffin's youth, he remembered a voyage where a crewman brought a caged owl, insisting it brought luck. The bird died on the third day. So did the man, 6 days later, swept overboard in a storm. For years, everyone said the two were linked, as if the owl's death opened some cosmic trapdoor. But Hraffin knew better. The man had removed his rope belt before going topside. He slipped. It wasn't fate, it was stupidity. But fate made for a better story, and no one likes to mourn a fool. The truth is, nature does not care what stories you assign to it. The raven doesn't fly for you. The whale doesn't adjust its path to help you. The clouds don't form symbols, and the stars don't rearrange for your convenience. They simply exist. And when you're navigating by things that don't know you're alive, the illusion of cooperation can be fatal. And yet, it wasn't all wrong. There were times when birds genuinely helped, when flocks circled land, when whale pods veered away from shallow rocks, when seabirds refused to fly far from their nesting grounds. These were useful patterns, repeated, observed, passed down. But even those became blurry at sea. Distances were hard to judge. A bird could fly for 50 kilometers easily. A whale might surface hundreds of miles from its feeding zone. So what do you do with that? Do you follow anyway? Or assume you've misread the signal? That's the navigator's constant riddle, deciding when to believe and when to question the belief itself. And questioning belief is hard when you're surrounded by believers. When the crew clings to the idea that the raven's absence is proof of safety, challenging it becomes heresy. Huffin knew the danger of correcting men in the middle of a faith-fueled theory. Once, on a previous voyage, a sailor named Brinjar claimed a dolphin swam in a circle near their ship to warn them of a storm. Huffin pointed out that dolphins often circle boats out of curiosity, or to fish. Brinjar took offence. That night, Huffin's food was, accidentally, left out in the rain. The next day, someone accidentally loosened the knot on his sleeping furs. Superstition wasn't just tolerated, it was enforced. and that enforcement was often petty. That's the criticism modern minds don't like to face. We admire the Vikings' bravery, their grit, their endurance, but we downplay their paranoia, their magical thinking, their habit of confusing correlation with causation. They were brave, yes, but also deeply, deeply prone to overinterpreting the world around them, which is understandable. When you're floating in a universe that refuses to explain itself, it's tempting to treat every seagull like a god. So here they were again. Another day. The wind weak, the sails half full, the crew staring out into the mist like it owed them an explanation. The water was glassy, the sky low. A fin appeared off the port side, dolphin or small whale. The men watched, tense. It breached once, then vanished. A good sign? A warning? Someone mumbled about it being the same fin from 3 days ago, that it was following them, protecting them. Hrafn said nothing. He had no energy to argue with folklore. That night, a bird finally returned. Not the same raven. A gull, perhaps. Dirty, tired-looking. It landed on the mast and refused to move. The crew watched in awe, as if it had just flown in from Asgard. Hrafn stared at it for a while, then looked back out to sea. The bird meant nothing. It was coincidence. An animal seeking rest. But the men slept easier that night. They believed again. And sometimes, belief, however misplaced, is more useful than clarity. But belief won't find land, and the sea, ever silent, never promised anything more. Chapter 6. Memory Maps and Oral Directions. Maps don't forget, but men do. And that is perhaps the greatest peril in a world where the only directions you own are buried in your skull. For Viking navigators like Hrafn, there was no paper chart to consult, no compass to whisper north, no logbook full of tidy Latin notations. There were instead sagas, sung, spoken, half-remembered stories that clung to the shape of coastlines like mist. The Viking map wasn't a thing, it was a performance. A mental theatre of routes, landmarks, turns and clues, rehearsed in firelight, recited at sea, and carved into memory, one storm at a time. Which works, right up until the moment someone misremembers a line, or forgets whether that outcropping was described as horse-shaped or serpent-faced. That small slip, it doesn't send you down the wrong street, it sends you across the wrong ocean. The system was called Siglingar Leithir, sailing directions, and it relied on what modern people would consider a terrifying amount of subjective confidence. Sail west until the sea darkens, then turn north until you see a flat-topped island with birds that shriek at dusk. That's a legitimate instruction from an actual Norse navigation account. Now imagine trying to follow it. Days from land, fog rolling in, crew grumbling. You ask, which birds? How many shrieks? What if it's morning? But there are no footnotes in oral tradition. You either trust the teller or you drown. These directions were handed down like heirlooms. One navigator trained another, who trained another, each adding, editing, forgetting, correcting. And while it worked just enough to keep voyages going, it also created a silent terror among seasoned sailors, the fear that the man you're following learned his craft from someone who once hit his head on a mast beam and forgot which side Greenland was on. Because memory is not only fallible, it's contagious. A single wrong phrase, passed down, becomes gospel. And then a dozen ships go missing, all thinking they're headed for Iceland when they're really aimed at the Arctic abyss. This was the tightrope Hrafn walked every day. He wasn't just steering a ship. He was reciting a song that had to be exactly right, even though he'd never heard it sung the same way twice. When he was young, he memorized routes by candlelight, chanting phrases like spells, 3 days west from Herlog's Head, past the cursing rocks, until you see the whale breach. What if there were no whales? What if the rocks didn't curse that day? What if you miscounted the days? The ocean wouldn't correct you. It would simply wait for the mistake and then consume you. Modern minds, of course, scoff at this. We carry GPS in our pockets, and can summon satellite images of the planet in seconds. But that's exactly the point. We're so pampered by technology that we've forgotten how monstrous the world used to feel, when every decision was made in a fog of uncertainty, and the line between confident navigation and a slow, drifting death was one poorly remembered stanza. We idolize the Vikings as warriors and explorers, but we rarely pause to acknowledge how absurdly brave or absurdly reckless it was to entrust your survival to the accuracy of a bedtime story. And let's not forget how fragile these oral maps were. Storms changed coastlines. Erosion erased familiar landmarks. Trees burned, cliffs collapsed, islands sunk. The world didn't hold still just because your memory did. A sailor might spend a year memorizing a route, only to find it altered by nature, broken by time. But there were no updates. No version 2.0. Only realization, panic, and improvisation. Still, the system persisted because it had to. The written word was a rare and expensive tool in Viking culture. Runes were carved into stone, not parchment. And long voyages couldn't rely on fragile materials anyway. Ink smudges, scrolls mold, and seawater is the world's most unforgiving editor. So memory reigned supreme. And to maintain it, navigators rehearsed constantly. They repeated routes aloud, turned directions into songs or poems, and relied on communal correction. If one man misremembered, others would chime in. Sometimes, when they weren't all guessing together, there was a kind of dark beauty to it. A ship, drifting through mist, guided by nothing but human recollection. Men staring into the unknown, anchored only by shared stories, their lives balanced on a few remembered phrases. And it worked, often enough to build trade routes, raid monasteries, and discover lands no one in Europe had ever heard of. But it also failed. Often. Spectacularly. The stories didn't mention those. The ships that never returned. The captains who took one wrong turn and became the bones at the bottom of a bay. They didn't become sagas. They became warnings, if they were remembered at all. The oral map is biased, you see. It only records the survivors. And that's the most dangerous lie of all. There's a memory Hrafn never shared. Years ago, he followed a route he'd been taught since boyhood. Followed the red rock past the screeching point. 4 days, then west. They followed it. Exactly. But the red rock had faded with age, worn smooth by centuries of storms. The screeching point was now home to a silent colony of seals. They didn't find land. They found nothing. For 6 days. On the 7th, half the crew began hallucinating from thirst. Hrafn changed course, blindly. They eventually found shore barely. But the story was never updated. No one changed the chant. It still lived in the mouths of other sailors, waiting to mislead someone else. And that's the paradox of oral tradition. It's alive, yes, but it doesn't always learn. It recites. It echoes. It obeys repetition more than truth. And when the world changes faster than the words, the navigator becomes a prisoner of his own education. Tonight, the stars are hidden again. The wind is calm. The sea, smug and endless. Hrafn repeats the directions in his head over and over, afraid to miss a beat. He's told these phrases for years. They have always worked. But tonight, they feel like a riddle. And the ocean doesn't wait for you to solve riddles. The chant went, "Past the whale's grave, where waves strike stone, count 3 duskfalls, then follow the gull scream westward." Hrafn had heard it 100 times, maybe more. It was one of the oldest sailing verses in the north. He could recite it drunk, in sleep, or half frozen. But now, on the 7th day of a voyage that had already outlived its optimism, he realized something unsettling. He didn't know who had first taught it to him. And worse, he wasn't sure what whale's grave referred to. There were rocks shaped like bones back home. But there were also 2 others farther west. And one of them had been destroyed in a landslide, if he remembered right. Maybe, possibly, he wasn't sure. Which meant the entire verse was wobbling in his head like a table with one leg missing. and beneath it waited the ocean, eager as ever to drag down whatever fell through the cracks. This was the unspoken terror of oral tradition. It didn't collapse with drama, it unravelled in silence, not through forgetting everything, but forgetting just enough. A name, a landmark, a timing cue. And when every direction depends on subtle cues layered in a precise sequence, even a small misstep can send you veering into nowhere. It's not like modern navigation, where a wrong turn gets recalculated with cheerful artificial voices. In Graffin's world, a wrong turn meant rowing for 2 days before realizing you'd been lied to by your own memory. And who could blame him? These oral maps weren't just fragile, they were alive. Alive in the way old houses are alive, full of creaks, habits, and the ghosts of people who swore they built it right the first time. They evolved not because someone revised them consciously, but because people remembered them differently. One captain might chant 4 dusk falls, another 3. One might swear it was gull scream, another seal bark. And in the moment, they'd both be absolutely certain. That's how memory works. It doesn't ask for permission before editing. It just mutters, "Trust me," and carries on. It wasn't like they didn't try to fix it. In Iceland, some attempted to codify sailing songs, make them consistent. But the moment a storm blew in or a crew landed off course and somehow survived, their version of the directions became gospel. We turn before the reef, not after. No, it's 5 dusk falls, not 3. Survival, not consensus, dictated truth. And in that system, every successful guess became law, even if the next man who followed it died. That's what was circling in Graffin's mind now. They'd passed the point where the chant said to turn. But something felt wrong. The sea wasn't shallow like it should have been. The sky didn't carry the usual birds. He could bluff, of course. Say the signs were subtle, that the waves were right, that the chant still held. The crew would nod. They trusted him, or pretended to. But the question was growing inside him like mould. What if the chant was wrong? Or worse, what if I've remembered it wrong? He didn't say it aloud. Navigators weren't allowed to doubt, not openly. Doubt spreads like infection. It doesn't just weaken your authority, it poisons the morale of 30 hungry men trapped on a floating coffin. So he smiled thinly and told the helmsman to adjust course. Inside he recited the chant again, over and over, listening for cracks, trying to convince himself that it still made sense. Let's pause to appreciate the absurdity. Imagine running a business today where your entire logistics system is based on remembered poems. No spreadsheets, no timetables, just Bob in accounting chanting. Left at the big oak, past the goose pond, then count to 8 and pray. That's the Viking navigational model. And yet it powered an entire era of expansion. Not because it was efficient, but because they had no choice. And because just enough men were stubborn or lucky or sharp-eyed enough to make it work. The ones who weren't, their names didn't survive. They drowned anonymously or starved on forgotten ice. Their stories weren't sung, their verses weren't repeated. Oral tradition is selective like that. It only remembers the winners, which means every chant Graffin carried in his head was, in its own way, a biased survivor. And that bias was lethal, because it made him believe he knew more than he actually did. He remembered an elder sailor once saying, "The chant is a candle, not a sun. Don't mistake its flicker for certainty." At the time, he thought it poetic. Now, drifting under a grey sky with no signs and 2 fewer days of food, it felt like a warning. Or maybe an apology. The crew had begun to notice the tension. No one said anything, but the oar rhythm was off. Meals were quieter. One man offered to sing the sailing verse himself, just to refresh memory. Graffin allowed it. The man's version was slightly different. Not enough to argue, but enough to make Graffin's spine itch. If he corrected it, he'd look insecure. If he didn't, he might be agreeing to a version that led them in circles. So he smiled again, nodded, and said, "Good memory." Then immediately began replaying the chant in his head for the 1,000th time. This was the real cost of oral navigation, not just the physical danger, but the mental erosion. The constant need to rehearse, reaffirm, rebelieve. You weren't allowed to forget. You weren't allowed to misremember. Your crew didn't care if your uncle taught you a version 2 words off. They cared whether land appeared on the horizon when you said it would. The chant didn't care either. It would live on, whether you did or not. Later that night, Hrafn sat alone at the bow, whispering the verse again. But this time, he said it differently, on purpose. He swapped gull scream for seal cry, changed 3 duskfalls to 4. It felt wrong, but only slightly. That's what chilled him, how easy it was, how natural it felt to shift a single phrase, and how instantly the whole world tilted with it. Because once the story changes, so does the course, and the sea never bothers correcting you. Chapter 7. Facing the Endless Night. The sun didn't rise today. It didn't rise yesterday either. It hasn't, in fact, made an appearance for over a week. Maybe 2. Hrafn has stopped counting. There's no point. Time has become something you feel in your bones rather than measure on a clock. And on a Viking ship drifting through the higher latitudes during the cold months, when the sun finally disappears for the season, it doesn't just take the light with it. It takes your rhythm, your memory, your grip on reality. Welcome to the endless night, the ocean's final insult. No stars, no sun, no way of telling whether you're headed forward or in circles, just cold, deep, biting, spiritual cold, and an aching kind of dark that seeps into your joints and whispers things you'd rather not hear. It wasn't supposed to be this way. The voyage should have rounded back weeks ago, but weather delayed them, currents betrayed them, and now here they are, somewhere north of Sensible, drifting through what might generously be called Arctic twilight. That eternal dusk, where the sky never commits to either day or night, and the sea looks like polished slate stretching to nothing. Navigation has become something ceremonial, half charade, half prayer. Hrafn still stands at the helm each morning, pretending to observe the direction of the light. But there is no light, just a dull gradient of charcoal and steel. He gestures. The crew obeys. They row not because they believe, but because they can't afford to stop. And this is where the real horror begins. Not the storms, not the frostbite, not even starvation, but the psychological decay that comes when human beings are untethered from the sun. You don't notice it at first. A sleepless night here, a missed meal there. Then the laughter grows sharp. The jokes die faster. The crew stops talking about what they'll do when they return and starts talking about what their mothers smelled like. Memory becomes loose, unreliable. And Hrafn, who was once certain of the stars, the wind, the birds, the chants, now finds himself whispering old directions under his breath, just to hear something definite in a world where nothing is. This darkness wasn't unknown to the Norse. Those who lived in Iceland or Greenland experienced long winters, weeks without proper daylight. But they experienced it on land inside homes, with fire, with predictable walls and rituals to keep their minds anchored. On a ship, everything unravels faster. The cold is constant, the wind indifferent, and sleep becomes a gamble. Too little, and you hallucinate. Too much, and you miss the faintest clues of land, if they even exist. The line between exhaustion and madness starts to blur. One man on Hrafn's crew claimed he heard the sun humming beneath the water. Another began speaking to the mast like it was his dead brother. These aren't exaggerations. This is what happens when you remove light from a species biologically addicted to it. The worst part is, they still try to navigate. Out of habit, out of duty, out of fear. But there is nothing to guide them. No stars to track, no sun to follow, no visible changes in the sky. The sea offers nothing but repetition. Wave after wave, identical, meaningless. The ship creaks in the same rhythm every hour. Even the gulls have vanished. The world feels paused, except for the slow erosion of mines aboard the ship. Time doesn't pass. It stretches, like a thread pulled taut, just waiting to snap. And still, Hruffen must pretend. He cannot falter, not visibly. He gives orders. He nods at winds that don't exist. He mutters something about a current he recognizes. It's all theatre. But sometimes, theatre is survival. If the crew believes he knows what he's doing, they will keep rowing. If they keep rowing, they might move. And if they move, they might survive. Maybe. Modern readers often romanticize polar darkness. What a beautiful metaphor, they say. The endless night. How poetic. No. There's nothing poetic here. It is bleak, silent annihilation. And what makes it so terrifying is not what it does to your body, but what it does to your sense of reality. Up becomes arbitrary. Forward becomes theoretical. The future becomes something you used to believe in. It's not the cold that kills. It's the collapse of the map inside your head. And let's be clear, even in their prime, Viking navigators were not trained for this. They were coastal raiders. Coastal traders. They hugged shorelines, followed seabirds, read cloud shadows over land. Long-haul polar voyages were not the norm. But ambition, bad luck, and bad timing can drag anyone into places they weren't designed to survive. This isn't a saga now, it's a drift into uncharted madness. In the absence of the sun, rituals start to take over. The crew begins offering pieces of dried fish to the sea each night. One man chants in a language that isn't Norse. Another sharpens his axe compulsively, even though no one has fought anything in days. These are survival mechanisms. The mind, when cut loose from nature's rhythms, begins inventing its own. Patterns, repetitions, symbols. They might be nonsense, but they are structured nonsense. And that structure is often the last thread between functioning and falling apart. Hruffen isn't immune either. Last night he dreamed of a tree made of stars. When he woke, he was certain he'd seen a constellation form in the clouds. It faded, of course, like everything else. But for those few seconds, he felt clarity. The kind of clarity only insanity or divine intervention can provide. And honestly, at this point, he's not interested in knowing which it was. What's remarkable is how long people can survive like this. Longer than they should. The body adapts, painfully. The mind compartmentalizes. And the ocean, well, the ocean remains indifferent. It's not trying to kill you, it simply doesn't notice you're alive. That night someone sees a faint glow on the horizon. A trick of the atmosphere? Aurora? Reflected ice? Doesn't matter. It becomes the new destination. The crew rows toward it with renewed purpose. They whisper things like, "It's east," or "the sun returning," or "land fire." They don't care what it is, it's something. And something is always better than more nothing. Whether that glow will lead them to salvation or deeper into the void is irrelevant for now. They believe again, and that belief is the only warmth they have left. The glow on the horizon turned out to be nothing. Not land, not fire, not the sun returning from its cold sabbatical. Just the faint shimmer of ice haze, catching distant starlight and mocking the desperation of the eyes that searched for it. The crew didn't speak of it again. No one cursed, no one blamed. They just stopped mentioning it. That's how hope dies in the endless night, not loudly, but quietly, like a lamp going out in the corner of a room no one wants to enter. The ship moved on, propelled less by belief and more by inertia, and every man aboard was now a participant in the slow disintegration of time. You'd think the cold would be the worst part, but it isn't. The body adjusts, layers are added, furs are tightened. The real enemy, the one that no sail or oar can outrun, is the distortion of the mind. Without sunlight, the circadian rhythm collapses. Days and nights blur together into one grey pulse. Men start to sleep at odd hours, or not at all. Some dream with their eyes open. Some talk in circles, forgetting mid-sentence what they were angry about. One man insists he heard a goat bleating below deck. They haven't carried goats in over a month, and Raffin watches it happen. Watches his crew fragment at the edges, while pretending he isn't doing the same. He still chants the sailing verses in the morning, still performs the rituals, touches the prow 3 times before taking the rudder, nods toward where the sun should be, and announces a direction based on nothing but the absence of contradiction. It's theatre, yes, but it's necessary, because even when the play becomes absurd, it gives the audience something to believe in. And belief, however hollow, holds a ship together longer than reason. He's not the first to navigate this far north, and he won't be the last. There were sagas barely remembered, of voyages lost in the dark, whispers of ships that vanished, only to be found months later frozen into the ice, sails half raised, crew curled up in death like they were trying to become smaller. One tale tells of a navigator who mistook a glacier for a god and led his men into a frozen bay where they sang to the ice until they starved. The stories don't always say whether they were real. That's the thing about polar myths. They grow out of the dark like mushrooms, soft, pale, and thriving on rot. The crew has begun rewriting the voyage in real time. They speak less of direction and more of symbolism. That glow from 2 days ago? It was never about land. It was a sign from the ancestors. The ice patterns on the prow? They resemble runes. One man believes he saw Odin in a dream, pointing toward the west. When questioned, he gets defensive. You weren't there. You didn't hear the voice. That's what it's come to, leadership by hallucination. Raffin doesn't argue. What's the point? They need these illusions now. The mind craves narrative when truth disappears. Without light, without stars, without even a gull to insult, the crew builds meaning out of anything. And that meaning, however warped, becomes a survival mechanism. The moment you admit there's nothing out there, that's when your hands go limp on the oar. One of the older rowers, Skedgy, begins carving shapes into the mast. At first it's just lines. Later they become faces. Then the faces begin changing daily. When asked what they are, he says, "They're the people we've passed." There's an uncomfortable pause after that. Everyone knows they haven't passed anyone in weeks. Food is running low again. Dried fish and soaked bread crusts. Water must be rationed more carefully, though they've been melting slush scraped from the deck for days. No one wants to admit they can taste wood in the water. No one wants to think about what the barrels once held. Raffin calculates their stores. It's not enough. But he says nothing. The crew doesn't need the truth. They need a direction to row. It's not all horror. There are still strange moments of peace. One night the clouds part just enough to reveal the northern lights. Green ribbons whip across the sky like silk in wind. The men stare in silence, mouths open, exhausted awe on their faces. For a moment, the darkness feels less hostile. Then the lights fade. Someone coughs. Someone else mutters a prayer. And the ship creaks back into motion. Let's pause to appreciate how utterly dependent these men are on things no one today would tolerate. Can you imagine running a cross-country trip today based on a guy reciting a poem from memory while guessing where the sun might be behind a month's worth of overcast sky? No cell service, no maps, just hope and momentum. And yet we praise these men as if their success was inevitable. It wasn't. They survived not because of Viking genius, but because the few who got lucky became legends. And legends never list the odds. And Raffin knows this. Deep down, he knows they are not forging new ground. They are trying to avoid becoming another cautionary tale, another half-sung ballad about a crew who turned the wrong way in the endless night and were never seen again. He feels the pressure of legacy on his shoulders. He's not trying to be a hero. He's trying not to be forgotten. The night continues. The ship moves. The men row. No one asks where they're going anymore. They simply follow. Not because they believe, but because movement still feels like resistance. And resistance, no matter how futile, still feels better than floating. At some point, a crewman suggests they should turn back. The suggestion hangs in the air like smoke. No one answers. There is no back. Not really. Back is just another direction, with no sun to verify it. And so the voyage continues into shadow, into silence, into the slow, mutating dark that reshapes the mind and swallows every certainty. The ocean does not rage. It does not scream. It simply waits. And that, Hruffin realizes, is worse. Because in this world, madness doesn't arrive like a storm. It drips, quiet, patient, familiar, just like the night. Chapter 8. Fog, Storms, and Sudden Death. The storm didn't begin with thunder. It began with silence. The kind of silence that flattens the world and makes even seasoned sailors hold their breath. Hruffin felt it before he heard it. A shift in the air, heavy and waiting, as if the ocean had decided it was done playing games. The endless night had softened the crew, lulled them into monotony. But the North Atlantic doesn't do favours forever. It lets you drift just long enough to believe in safety, then reminds you, with all the subtlety of a hammer, that you were never in control. The fog came first. Not the soft, wispy fog of morning valleys, but a wall-dense, wet and blinding. It wrapped around the ship like wool soaked in ice water. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Voices became ghosts. Footsteps on deck turned into muffled suggestions. And with the fog came disorientation. Not the charming kind, where you forget which direction is east. No, this was the kind where up and down began to argue. Where the sound of your own oar splashing made you wonder if it was coming from below, or behind, or inside your head. Navigation? Gone. Sun? Invisible. Stars? Forgotten. The chants and memory routes that Hruffin had lived by for years meant nothing now. Turn at the red cliff? What cliff? What colour? Every direction looked like wet cotton and regret. And worse, it moved. The fog shifted constantly, like a living thing. One moment it pressed in from the starboard, the next from behind. No patterns, no logic, just rolling suffocation. Then came the wind. Sudden, violent, and from the wrong direction. It slapped the sail sideways, cracked the ropes, and tore at the ship with the glee of a predator stretching its claws. Hruffin shouted orders, but the wind ate them. The mast groaned. One of the side oars cracked with a noise that felt more like a sentence than a sound. The rain followed, but not from the sky. It seemed to come from everywhere. Not drops, but sheets. Waves peeled sideways. Water filled the air. Breathing became something you tried, not something you did. And then, of course, the sea rose. There's no elegant way to describe this. It doesn't rise like a tide. It lurches. One minute you're on water, the next you're above it, the next you're inside it. The boat was not built for elegance. Viking ships were strong, yes. Flexible, yes. But they were open. Low-sided. Vulnerable. Meant for speed and shallows, not for standing up to gods. This storm wasn't just bad weather. It was judgment. A declaration from the ocean that your plans, your memory chants, your raven tricks and sunstones and stories, all of it was nonsense. And it didn't just want to kill you. It wanted you to understand how small you were first. The crew scrambled, buckets tossed. One man tied himself to the mast, muttering psalms from a religion he'd previously mocked. Another fell. No one saw him go. They found the rope swinging from the deck hours later. Hruffin didn't know his name. He only knew he was down to 27 men, and that number would keep slipping. And here's where the criticism creeps in. Because let's not pretend the romanticised Viking explorer image holds up here. The shows and books and historical illustrations love to depict these men as stoic heroes, backlit by lightning, shouting into the wind with fearsome joy. But no one shouts in storms like this. They hunch. They tremble. They throw up. Courage doesn't look like a statue. It looks like crawling across a tilted deck in your own piss, trying to retie a sail that's whipping like a demon's flag. Modern people don't grasp this scale of vulnerability. We're protected by architecture, by forecasts, by the assumption that nature is manageable. But on a Viking ship in the North Atlantic, there's no fallback, no radio, no rescue. Just 30 men and a wooden coffin trying not to split open on the back of an angry wave. The worst part wasn't the chaos. It was what came after. The moment the storm paused, just briefly. No lightning, no howling, just a single lull. Hrafn stood at the helm, soaked, frozen, bleeding from a cut he didn't remember receiving. He looked out into the dark, and for one breathless instant, he thought it was over. That's when the second wave hit. They called them Hestbaldur horse waves. Giant, rogue swells that broke from nowhere, no rhythm, no warning. This one hit from the side, lifted the ship, twisted it mid-air, and slacked it down like a child punishing a toy. Wood cracked. Screams cut through the rain. A man slid across the deck and vanished overboard. They didn't even try to retrieve him. You don't recover people in water like this. You just hope someone else doesn't go next. Hrafn's grip slipped. He caught himself on the rudder post. His shoulder dislocated. He didn't scream. He just cursed the ocean's name, in a voice barely audible over the wind. This was not a test of skill. This was not a proving ground for the worthy. It was erasure. Nature's reminder that it owes you nothing, remembers you not at all, and will destroy you not with vengeance, but with boredom. You are a blemish on its surface, and it is wiping the slate. And yet the ship survived. Somehow. By dawn. If you could call it that, since the sky never really changed, the sea began to calm. The fog pulled back. The rain slowed. One by one, the crew reappeared from whatever corners they'd wedged themselves into. Bloodied. Shivering. One man missing half an ear. 2 others not present at all. They would not be added to the saga. They would be subtracted from it. No one spoke for hours. There was no celebration, no speeches. Just the sound of tired wood creaking in rhythm with exhausted oars. Hrafn said nothing either. He had no poetry left. The ocean had wrung it out of him. The irony, of course, is that this is the part modern people romanticize the most. The survival. The endurance. The grit. But what they never ask is, at what cost? What part of a man gets scraped away to come through this? What memory gets stolen? What fear stays in the blood? Because storms don't just pass, they stay inside you. The sea had calmed. Not politely. Not with a gentle exhale and a painted sky. No. It calmed the way a drunk finally passes out after flipping the table and smashing every dish. Quiet, yes, but surrounded by wreckage. The waves had softened. The wind had tucked itself back into the clouds. The fog, still present, now hovered like a sulking ghost just out of reach. And the longship, bruised and bowed, floated in the aftermath, like a thing trying to remember what it used to be. No one spoke. Not because of awe or reverence or the poetic weight of survival, but because speaking required energy, and most of the men had none left. The storm hadn't just drained their bodies. It had scraped something invisible from them, something vital, morale perhaps, or belief. You survive storms not with courage, but with submission. You hold on, you endure, and when it's over, you pretend it didn't change you. But it always does. And on this voyage, every man now carried the haunted posture of someone who knew the sea had let them live out of indifference, not mercy. Hrafn sat slumped at the stern, his left arm still useless from the dislocation. He'd tied it against his chest with rope and a scrap of torn sail. It didn't hurt anymore. Nothing did. Pain had been replaced by that strange numbness that comes after too much adrenaline and too little food. He stared at the horizon, not expecting anything to be there. He just needed something to look at that wasn't his crew, because they were starting to look at him, with that quiet, expectant gaze that says, "Now what?" And he had no answer. The sea, flatter now, seemed almost peaceful. But anyone who spent time in the open ocean knows that calm water after a storm is never comforting. It's not serenity, it's detachment. The sea, like a sociopath, doesn't reflect on its actions. It simply forgets. The same waves that tried to kill you an hour ago now bob gently beneath the keel as if nothing happened. There is no apology, no closure, just more water. A seal appeared briefly to the east, bobbing like a floating stone. One of the men pointed. No one responded. Not because seals weren't interesting, they were, but because their presence no longer meant anything. Before the storm, a seal might have sparked a debate, land nearby, a sign from the gods. A good omen? Now? It was just a wet mammal doing its job. The crew had run out of meaning. They had no space left for metaphor. And still the ship floated. Still the sail caught small gusts. Still the oars dipped mechanically. Not because anyone knew where they were going, but because not moving felt like giving up. And no one wanted to be the first to suggest that. Here's the part that tends to get skipped in the sagas, the after. The part where your ship is intact, your crew mostly alive, and yet no one feels victorious. Because surviving a storm at sea doesn't come with a ribbon or a feast. It comes with confusion, with silence, with the creeping realization that survival doesn't equal salvation. You're still lost, still hungry, still wet, still trapped on a piece of wood floating in a world that doesn't care you exist. And worse, there's still no sun, no stars. The night is back, patient and blank, as if the storm was just an intermission and now the real show resumes. Modern adventure stories love to end here, with the storm survived and the path ahead clear. But that's not how it works. Storms don't solve anything. They just shift your problems around. Now Hrafn had fewer men, a damaged ship, and a crew who had tasted helplessness deeply enough to start wondering whether the man steering them was actually in control or just louder than the rest. The rituals began again, tentatively. A sailor sprinkled salt over the deck, muttering half-remembered chants. Another man polished the bronze brooch on his chest like it held secrets. Superstition is like mould. It returns strongest after the flood. And who could blame them? The storm had broken the known world. Now, in the stillness, they needed something, anything to believe in again. Symbols are easy. Reality isn't. Hrafn didn't interfere. Let them chant. Let them scratch runes into the mast and talk about omens in the clouds. If it kept their hands rowing and their minds from collapse, then it had value. That was leadership now. Not inspiration, not wisdom, but containment. Keep the madness quiet. Keep the doubt to yourself. One crewman, young and narrow-faced, approached Hrafn at dusk. His eyes were wide, not with fear, but hunger for answers, for hope, for anything besides this limbo. "We should have seen land by now," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement wrapped in accusation. Hrafn nodded once. He didn't argue. What could he say? The chant said they should have. The stars, when they were visible, had hinted at it. The birds had flown west. The seaweed, even, had pointed in the right direction. But land hadn't appeared. And now the chant, the stars, the birds, all of it felt like bad advice from someone who'd never actually been on a boat. And that's where the sarcasm sets in, because really, what kind of civilization sends men into the open sea with directions that amount to row west until the sky changes? What kind of genius builds a navigational system around poetic phrases and hopes the coastline still looks like a snakehead? Viking bravery wasn't the absence of fear. It was institutionalized guesswork, wrapped in fur and sung like scripture. And yet, they had made it. Before. Vikings had reached Greenland, Iceland, even North America, depending on how much you believed the sagas. So it had worked. Sometimes. That was the hook that kept everyone rowing. The hope that this time would be one of the lucky ones. that the storm was just the final test before landfall, not a signpost pointing nowhere. But the sea offered no clarification, no feedback. It simply cradled the ship and waited. That night, they ate what was left of the smoked herring. Water was rationed again. A man coughed all through his shift. No one asked why. No one wanted to know. And as the fog returned, curling low and slow across the water, Hrafn closed his eyes, whispered the route again under his breath, and told himself they were close. He had to. Because if he stopped saying it, even in the quiet of his own head, then it might become true that they weren't. Chapter 9. From Greenland to Vinland. There comes a moment in every voyage where the idea of home stops being a destination and starts becoming a memory. For Hrafn and his crew, that moment arrived the day they passed the last cragged edge of Greenland's coast and entered a sea so vast, so featureless, that even the most experienced among them went silent. No chanting, no humming, just the rhythmic slap of oars against a cold Atlantic that stretched into the kind of nowhere cartographers used to label with dragons. They had left Greenland not out of confidence, but out of obligation. Supplies were dwindling, and the island behind them, while brutal, icy, and indifferent, had nothing left to offer. And ahead? Rumour. Hearsay. Vinland. A place described in sagas as fertile and warm, full of grapes and game, and blessedly less frostbitten than every other land the Norse had settled. The problem? No one agreed exactly where it was, or how long it took to get there, or if it even existed outside the drunken recollections of Leif Erikson, and a few men who'd gone missing for a while and returned with tans and suspicious optimism. Still, the sagas persisted, and in a world where you navigated by story, that was enough. So they rowed, into the unknown, into a horizon that never changed, clouds above, water below, a ship in between carrying 30 men, one damaged mast, and enough salted fish to make optimism taste like salt and scale. Hrafn gave the orders. He kept the chance alive. He watched the birds. He sniffed the air. But he knew, this part of the voyage wasn't about skill. It was about luck. Or madness. Or both. There were no islands to use as waypoints. No known currents to follow. No seabirds offering breadcrumb trails to the shore. Just open water. Swells that rolled in from the deep with no pattern and no explanation. Days passed, then more. The men stopped asking how long. Hrafn stopped answering. He just said soon, and let them decide what that meant. This stretch of ocean has a name now, the Labrador Sea, stretching between Greenland and Newfoundland. But names offer the illusion of familiarity. Back then, it was simply the sea that might never end, and it was colder than expected, always. Even in the so-called warmer months, the fog returned often, not with drama, but with quiet persistence. It curled around the deck like the breath of some sleeping god, and with each passing day, the silence grew. This was the truth no one tells when they celebrate Viking discovery of America. It wasn't discovery. It was drift. It was a gamble, placed by men with no better options, and just enough food to see if myth had a shoreline. No accurate maps, no feedback, no guarantee they wouldn't simply sail off the edge of everything they knew. And still they went. Not because they were fearless, but because staying still was worse. By the 7th day, the crew had entered that dull, trance-like state that always follows prolonged exposure to monotony and fear. Not boredom fear, because boredom implies safety. This was different. This was the fear of having nothing left to react to. No changes, no signs. Just a creeping dread that maybe they had passed Vinland already, or missed it by a sliver, and were now on a slow, wet march into oblivion. Hrafn still tried. He released birds. They didn't return. He studied cloud patterns. They betrayed him. Even the swells had stopped making sense. Once he would have counted them, used their rhythm to guess distance. Now they all felt the same. The sea had flattened into uniform hostility. The men began to whisper about the end of the world. Not dramatically, just matter-of-factly, as if this ocean might simply go on forever, and they'd been fools to think otherwise. There's something unique about maritime despair. It isn't sharp, it's dull, like a stone pressed into your chest. Not enough to kill you, just enough to keep you from breathing right. And yet, despite everything, they kept rowing. Here's where we pause to dismantle another modern delusion, that the Vikings were always in control of their voyages, that they arrived where they intended, guided by superior knowledge and a bit of Nordic grit. No. Much of what we call exploration was just survival with good PR. The only reason we know about Vinland is because one ship made it once and returned with stories. No one writes sagas about the ones who sailed too far, missed the coast, and froze to death in an empty ocean. Those men don't get remembered. They get absorbed. Still, somehow, land did appear. Not with trumpets or a sudden miracle, just a faint line in the haze. A bump. A trick of light that turned out to be real. Trees. Low hills. A shoreline that didn't immediately scream death. The men didn't cheer. They just stared. As if their brains hadn't fully accepted the idea yet. They had reached something. Was it Vinland? No one knew. The sagas were vague. A land with vines, they said. But it was October. No vines to be seen. Just rough forests and bitter wind. But it wasn't ice. It wasn't ocean. And that was enough. Hrafn gave the order to land. The crew obeyed slowly, as if stepping onto land might break the spell. The keels scraped against gravel. Oars lifted, feet touched earth. One man dropped to his knees, not out of gratitude, but just to feel weight again. The landing was not triumphant, it was confused, tense, the kind of relief that's half terror, because now they had to survive here, and they had no idea where here was. But they had made it, and that was all the saga needed. The land was silent when they arrived. Too silent, no birdsong, no crashing surf, just wind through the trees, if you could call those knotted, stunted things trees. Hrafn stood ankle-deep in a gravel shore, staring into the pine-thick wilderness, breathing air that somehow felt older than Greenland's frost. This was it, Vinland or something pretending to be it. But he could already feel the lie in his bones. This place wasn't waiting for them. It wasn't inviting, it was tolerating. The first night they slept on the ship. Not out of caution, but because no one wanted to test how far the land's indifference extended. At least on the water they had rules, known dangers, predictable cold. The land, that was chaos in tree form. And it smelled different, not rot, not life, just wet history. The next morning, Hrafn ordered a small crew to explore inland. Axes were drawn, not for battle, but to clear brush and make the illusion of progress. They found berries, a stream, deer tracks, then nothing. The forest swallowed them. Trees grew too close. Visibility was a joke. Every rustle in the underbrush sounded like a threat, even if it turned out to be wind or rabbit. Back at the shore, the men built a crude shelter, logs lashed together with soaked rope, a thatch roof that dripped more than it blocked. This was no settlement, it was a shrug in timber. But it was something, and after weeks at sea, something felt like enough. Until the arrows came. No war cry, no drumbeat, just a hiss through the air and the thud of wood or flesh. 2 men fell. 1 bled out before anyone could scream. The attackers were unseen shadows behind trees, ghosts with better aim. Hrafn pulled the crew back to the ship. They left the dead behind. There was no time to carry them, and besides, no one wanted to touch what had been claimed by this place. Welcome to Vinland. Here's a truth rarely mentioned in textbooks. The Vikings weren't invincible. They were loud, they were stubborn, but invincible? No, and certainly not here. The native peoples of North America, Skraelings, as the Norse called them, weren't primitive. They were smart, mobile, and had no interest in sharing real estate with pale men in iron hats who couldn't even build proper roofs. And why would they? This was their land, their forest, their silence. So the Vikings stayed close to the shore, ventured only in groups, slept in shifts, ate dry fish and tried not to argue, but tension fermented like spoiled mead. Some wanted to go back. Others insisted they push forward. Hrafn? He just wanted clarity. But this land gave none, no signs, no omens. Just that same wind, that same distant crack of branches, as if the woods were laughing too softly to be heard. They tried trading once shiny beads, scraps of cloth, a rusted comb. The natives took them, offered furs, then disappeared. It wasn't a relationship. It was a test. And the Vikings failed the second they let their weapons show. You can't trade with a hand on your axe. The forest remembers things like that. Winter came fast. Not like in Iceland, where snow announced itself politely. Here, it dropped like a guillotine. Ice crept into their boots. Frost claimed their shelters. And still no help, no backup. Just one ship, half a crew, and a land that did not want them. One man vanished. Another followed. Tracks led into the trees, then stopped. Some whispered of spirits. Others blamed the Skraelings. But most, in their hearts, knew the truth. This place was alive, and it was pruning the infestation. There were no more chants, no more sagas sung by firelight, just cold, breath, and silence. Hrafn grew quiet too. He stopped pretending. No more declarations, no more strategy. Just inventory, how many men left, how much food, how long the sail would take back. Because, yes, they left. Eventually. They didn't conquer Vinland. They didn't even settle it. They visited. Briefly. And the land showed them the door. Let's talk about that for a moment. Modern narratives like to treat this as a missed opportunity, as if all the Norse needed was a bit more luck, a few more reinforcements, and a sturdier fence. But that's hindsight arrogance. The Vikings weren't driven out because they lacked vision. They were driven out because they didn't belong, and they knew it. Every bird that flew overhead, every twig that snapped in the night, it all whispered the same thing: go home. And unlike other conquerors, the Norse occasionally listened to the land. They set fire to what they'd built, if you could call it building, and sailed north. Not triumphantly, not with loot, just away. Back to Greenland, back to silence they understood. The forest behind them swallowed their traces, the shore erased their footprints, and Vinland went back to being myth. And yet, the story survived. Why? Because it had to. Because no one wanted to admit they'd lost to trees. So they rewrote it, focused on the grapes, on the potential, on the sheer boldness of the voyage. And they left out the part where they ran, but we remember it here. Quietly, sleepily. Because it matters. Vinland wasn't failure. It was a mirror. And the reflection wasn't flattering. Chapter 10, The Return and the Myth. When the ship finally creaked into Greenland's harbour, there were no horns, no torchlit parades, no children cheering along the docks or bards scrambling for fresh ink. Just snow. Damp, slushy snow that greeted them like an old, disapproving uncle. And in a way, that felt appropriate. Because while they had left as voyagers chasing glory, they returned as men who had survived a fantasy, only to realize that fantasy doesn't keep you warm in winter. Hrafn didn't step off the ship with pride. He stepped off because his knees threatened to give out. Behind him, the few remaining crew members shuffled like ghosts, boots soaked, eyes sunken, carrying nothing but the weight of memory. Vinland. The promised land. It hadn't promised them anything, and it hadn't delivered much either. Just a few bruised egos, some scrawled maps, and a well-earned sense of caution about green shores and tall tales. But humans are curious creatures. And Nordic humans? Even more so. By the time the snow had crusted over the deck planks, the story had already begun to shift. Vinland became not the site of retreat, but the land of exploration, of potential, of rich forests and wild grapes and limitless bounty. Did the storytellers conveniently forget the ambushes, the frostbite, and the silence that screamed louder than any storm? Of course they did, because nobody sings ballads about failure, and thus the myth took root. It started innocently enough. A sagaman asking questions. A surviving crew member answering carefully, leaving out the parts with crying or desertion. Soon the gaps filled themselves. The forests grew taller. The rivers shimmered more poetically. And the Skraelings? They became curiosities instead of threats, minor footnotes in what was clearly a heroic adventure. Vinland had been reached. That was the important part. What happened after was less marketable. Critics today might roll their eyes, but let's not pretend this sort of revisionism died with the sagas. Every nation has its Vinland, a place they poked at briefly, misunderstood entirely, then declared a triumph anyway. It's a strange habit of empires, to frame survival as victory and retreat as wisdom. We love the idea of reaching new worlds. We're just less fond of admitting we weren't invited. Hrafn never argued. He let the myth grow. What else could he do? No one wanted to hear about wet cloaks and missing fingers. They wanted glory. And if glory meant trimming a few truths and rounding off some very sharp edges, then so be it. He gave a few interviews, so to speak. Let the younger men tell it better. Nodded when they called him brave, even though he remembered that night in the forest when he didn't sleep, certain he'd be found with an arrow through his throat. Greenland became a stage. The returning crew became props. Their stories, edited and repackaged, flowed across the fjords. By the time it reached Iceland, Vinland had already become a land of wonder. By the time it reached Norway, people were planning expeditions. And by the time it reached Denmark, Vinland might as well have been Eden with better lumber. The irony, of course, is that the Norse never truly settled it. A few more attempts. A couple of miserable winters. Then silence. The land refused to play along. It had its own rhythms, its own rules. And while iron swords and wooden shields might intimidate on European soil, they meant very little to a place that had no use for conquest. You can't subdue a forest, not really. You can just hope it doesn't eat you. And yet, the myth endured. Centuries later, explorers would still reference Vinland. Historians would still debate the coordinates. Flags would be planted in places already inhabited, and every inch of forest would become a battleground for competing narratives. Who found what? Who got there first? Who deserves the credit? It's almost funny, in a sad sort of way, how the need to discover often overshadows the ability to understand. And as for Hrafn, he faded, as most real men do behind their fictional counterparts. His name barely mentioned, his role diluted to a background figure in someone else's legend. But that suited him fine. He never asked for songs, he just wanted to come back alive. Maybe that's the quiet moral here. Not every journey ends in conquest. Not every explorer needs a monument. Sometimes returning with your wits intact is the only success worth celebrating. And sometimes the most valuable thing you bring back isn't gold or fame. It's the story, the real one. The one you whisper when the fire burns low and no one else is listening. But history doesn't like whispers. It prefers banners, statues, textbooks with neat margins and uncomfortable omissions. And so, we keep repeating ourselves, sailing into new lands, rewriting what happened and wondering why the past never seems to stay in the past. But at least here, tonight, we remember. Hrafn, the crew, the truth, not the polished saga or the patriotic verse, but the cold, damp, often absurd reality of men who sailed too far, chasing something that didn't want to be found. And maybe, just maybe, that's worth more than a statue. By the time the embers of the last Vinland fire cooled into ash, The myth had already taken on a life of its own, not in the sense of accuracy or legacy, but in the way a half-told joke becomes gospel after enough retellings. Hrafn, who never asked for immortality, had become immortal in the most Viking way possible, not through victory, but through narrative inflation. Because nothing inflates quite like a tale told too many winters in a row by men who forgot the cold. You see, centuries would pass before the next big leap westward, but the blueprint had already been laid. Sailors and monarchs alike would reach for sagas as though they were maps. And in a painfully predictable twist, everyone seemed far more invested in planting flags on other people's soil than actually understanding the soil itself. Vinland, though abandoned and silent, became a rallying cry for expansion, misquoted by kings and misused by poets. Its name echoed in courts and castles, usually by those who couldn't find north without a servant pointing. There's something bleakly amusing about that one of the greatest navigational cultures in history, seafaring legends, celestial readers, masters of current and sail, ended up feeding the myths of empires who got lost crossing a bay. The irony drips thicker than pine tar. Hrafn and his men couldn't conquer Vinland, but centuries later, people who never left their drawing rooms would insist they had. The church even tried to co-opt the myth. Because of course it did. There were sermons sung about brave Christian Vikings taming wild lands, as though communion wafers had anything to do with withstanding a Nova Scotian blizzard. Crusaders of parchment and ink rewrote the voyage until it aligned with divine providence. Vinland. The savage became Vinland the saved. And just like that, geography became theology. Meanwhile, back in reality, the Norse colonies were collapsing. Greenland settlement shriveled under harsher winters and worsening trade. Iceland turned inward, focusing more on sheep than ships. And the grand legacy of transatlantic ambition? It sat buried beneath snow and pride. No monuments, no standing stones, just a few sagas, passed quietly between old men with better memories than agendas. Let's not forget what the Vikings actually navigated. Skies, stars, winds, tides, and more danger than most modern sailors could process. They didn't have GPS, they had ravens and rumour. They didn't have rescue crews. They had prayer and bone-deep stubbornness. And yet, somehow, they crossed entire oceans in boats that today wouldn't pass a maritime safety inspection. But the real tragedy? Their achievements were too early to be celebrated and too late to be understood. When Columbus stumbled into the Caribbean half a millennium later, people cheered. He had letters from monarchs and funding from bankers. Hrafn had a headache and a mast that needed constant patching. Yet history treats one like a trailblazer and the other like a trivia question. Why? Because discovery, like any good marketing term, favours winners who write the minutes. The Norse navigators didn't build empires. They didn't extract gold or enslave continents. They showed up, saw the warning signs, and left. In hindsight, that might make them the wisest explorers of all. But wisdom rarely wins statues. Academics now argue over artefacts. A rusty nail here, a post hole there. Entire dissertations constructed around whether a shard of pottery counts as evidence of Norse presence. The debates rage on, not because the truth is elusive, but because admitting the truth would mean facing the limits of our romanticized history. The Vikings didn't colonize North America. They visited, briefly, and then decided not to die there. Imagine that. Imagine a world where knowing when to leave is considered heroic, but we don't honour restraint, we honour conquest. And so the saga of Vinland becomes a footnote, while louder names get page after gilded page. Still, in the quiet corners of museums, a few broken artefacts sit behind glass. A rivet, a cloak pin, a carved bone needle. Not much to build a nation on, but enough to whisper, we were here. We tried. It wasn't worth it. And maybe, just maybe, we were smart enough to know that. And Hrafn, if he were here to see the stories told in his name, he'd probably laugh. A short, sharp bark of disbelief. Not because he doubted the myth's power, but because he knew what it cost. Frostbitten fingers. Dead crewmates. The sound of arrows hitting flesh. He'd laugh, shake his head, and pour another cup of whatever passed for liquor that winter. Because, in the end, history is less about truth and more about what we need to believe. And we needed to believe the world could be claimed like a sword or a ship. We needed to believe that the first to step on shore owns the soil. That maps mean mastery, that flags mean forever. But the forest knows better, the river knows better. And somewhere beneath a collapsed hut and a long-forgotten shoreline, the wind still whispers what the sagas won't, that some lands don't want discovering. They want respect. And those who fail to offer it, no matter how skilled their navigation, are destined to vanish back into the sea, legends trailing behind them like kelp in the tide. And so the voyage drifts to its close. Whether our navigator Hafan found land or simply faded into the sea like so many before him is irrelevant now, because the point was never whether he succeeded. It was that he tried. That he stared into the horizon, not with certainty, but with desperation, dressed up as instinct, tradition whispered as truth. And he rowed anyway. That's what it meant to be a Viking navigator, not a map holder or a hero, but a man trapped between stories and storms, gambling that memory could outwit nature. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't, but every chant, every raven, every mistake carved a path that would one day be called exploration, though in truth it was closer to wandering with conviction. Modern life has given us clarity, coordinates, compass apps, digital voices that say recalculating when we stray. But back then, recalculating meant starvation. A wrong turn meant erasure. And yet they went. Again and again. Not because they were fearless, but because staying still was worse. So tonight, if you drift off imagining yourself at the helm of a longship, staring into fog, clutching a sunstone that may or may not work, remember this: the ocean never needed you, but you went anyway. Sleep well, navigator. Tomorrow brings another tide.